Good morning, everyone. Thanks for getting up on this very chilly morning. I didn't come down this morning. I live in the Seattle area, but my wife and I drove down yesterday thinking that we might have weather conditions like this. Anyway, it's a great pleasure to be back here in the Portland area where we lived for 19 years before going up to the Seattle area in '96. So my topic for today is business in China, opportunities for American companies, but I'm going to share with you today from a very personal perspective. There is so much news about China in the press these days. Hardly a day goes by without some other announcement about this or that, and then coupled with the Olympics that are going to be taking place in August of this year. You can look on the web, read the newspaper for all the propaganda that comes out of China, all the news you'd care to. So I'm not going to belabor you with any of that, which you can easily look up by yourself, but instead share with you a few of my own personal experiences based on having lived there for 2.5 to 3 years, starting in January of 2004. Actually, that was my second time in China. I lived in Nanjing shortly after the Second World War as a young lad for about 3 years. My wife was born in Shanghai, so she still speaks the language and she has many relatives back there, and it was a joy to see them. But none of that has to do anything about business. But what is significant is that going back this time, after almost 50 years, it's shocking to see the change. In the interim, China has had 2 revolutions. In 1949, the communists took over the mainland from the nationalists, and then beginning in the mid-60s, for 10 years, they had an internal revolution of their own called the Cultural Revolution. Both of these were very violent, very brutal, and greatly changed the landscape of China. Socially, politically, economically, it's hard to conceive. The impact of the Cultural Revolution in particular is huge. It's inconceivable. If you think about China's history of thousands of years, for 10 years the government consciously, deliberately, vigorously sought to eradicate all vestiges of that civilization. And so today, what we have in China is a society that is devoid of that kind of ethical and moral framework, which we had for thousands of years. What we have is a moral vacuum. So this is an interesting environment in which to do business, ladies and gentlemen. For those of you who have been to China recently on business or as tourists, especially those of you who've gone as tourists, I would venture to guess you stayed in some very fancy 5-star hotels, which in many instances outclass the ones we have here in America. Some of them are just stunning in terms of their degree of luxury. And so if you've stayed in these 5-star hotels and you go from these big coastal cities like Shanghai or Guangzhou or Beijing, and you go on your whirlwind 2-week tour, you really haven't understood the real China, which is the problem for American businessmen. So American businessmen go to China, especially those who've never been there before and are uninitiated, and we're well practiced in our Western art of doing business. We think, yes, we'll just take the same things and apply them in China with great success. You're in for a huge shock, because below that sheen and that pretty image that China is portraying is a society, a culture, which is very foreign to Americans. So this was a huge shock to me. I was recruited to go because I had very good relationships with my present employer, Data.io, for whom I had consulted intensely over a period of 3 years and come to know them and they me very well. So when in 2003, mid-2003, they decided to go to China to set up a subsidiary, they thought of me. I declined because it had been so long and so many changes had taken place. I didn't think I could bring anything to the party. They insisted, because when you're setting up a subsidiary 7,000 miles away in a place that's totally unknown to you, having somebody you know there is probably the most fundamental requirement. So my wife and I talked about this, and finally we decided, okay, we'll go. Yes, I speak the language, but it has been 50 years and I no longer spoke it very well. I've forgotten how to read and write most of it. But my boss said to me, Bob, don't worry. Once you're thrown in the soup, it'll come back. Well, he was right, because it did come back. And I'm thankful to say that today I'm fluent again. And also with the excellent software that we have in computers, I can even write Chinese using the computer, using the phonetic pinyin. And you can too if you apply yourself a little bit. It's really quite marvelous. So anyway, I'm going to share with you now basically in a sequence of what you would have to do if you went to China. And along that path, what will happen is I'll naturally have an opportunity to talk with you, share with you about some high-profile issues that you'll encounter as you try to do business in China. So the first thing you do when you get to China, and this is just by way of an impression, if you were to go to Shanghai like I did, you'd land at Pudong Airport. The name Pudong refers to that area which is on the east side of the river on which Shanghai is located. The old city of Shanghai is on the west side of the river. Pudong is that part which is on the east side of the river. The river is called the Huangpujiang. Well, this area of Pudong, until 15 years ago, was rice paddies. In 15 years, they have managed to build a city. I mean, Pudong is a city in and of itself. It's sort of like the other side of the Willamette, right? Beaverton and Portland. Except Shanghai together has about 20 million people, about 5 million of whom are migrant workers who've come in from the farms, from the villages. And then Pudong itself probably has 5 million people. And they've built a city in the last 15 years of 5 million people. What do we have in Portland? 300,000? 15, I mean, this is a city with 5 million people or so, I'm guessing. But you cannot believe the construction. So we land at Pudong Airport, brand new, modern airport, more modern, bigger than any American airport that I've been to. I haven't been to every American airport, but this is an incredible airport. So come out of the airport, you get in the car, taxi, and you drive into the city, about a 40-minute drive, a well-paved highway. At first you look around, it seems kind of empty. But within minutes, you begin to see these high-rise buildings. And these are apartment houses, 50 stories high. One after another after another. I mean, this goes on. There must be hundreds of these things, maybe 1,000. And by the time you get into the center of Pudong, Pudong, by the way, is there is a section of Pudong which is the financial district of Shanghai. It's like Wall Street. The architecture is astounding. If you stand on the banks of the river, and the financial district is right there on the banks, and you look across the river, you see old Shanghai. It is magnificent at night. Stand on the other side of the river, look back at Pudong. The architecture exceeds anything I've seen in America. In terms of the lights, the variety of the architecture, incredible on the surface. If you look a little deeper, below this glistening sheen, the quality leaves something to be desired. So don't look too closely. Maybe in your 5 or 6 star hotels, it looked great, but when you went into the bathroom, oh boy, you know, it's not quite as good as it seems from a distance. But great strides, great improvements. So the initial impression as you first come into Shanghai is overwhelming. All right, so now very quickly you have to get down to the nitty-gritty of doing some work, like setting up the company. This is not a trivial task, ladies and gentlemen. It's so complicated, you really have to engage the services of an agent, a professional. Cost us about $5,000 US dollars for his services, probably more today. But this person leads you through this circuitous path, complicated path. First, you have to apply with the Ministry of Commerce for a business license. You have to submit a business plan with a pile of documentation. I'm running ahead of myself. Before I submit the application, I have to first acquire a business address. In other words, I have to go rent office space. That's not easy in Shanghai these days. The problem is, when you rent office space, they expect you to sign a lease. But there's no guarantee that you're going to get the business license. So if you don't get the business license, you're locked into the lease, and now you're sort of in China for no permitted reason. It's kind of an awkward situation. But that's the way it is. You have to go get yourself a lease. So then you show this, submit it with the application, and it takes maybe 6 weeks for this thing to be approved. Finally, you think, oh, got my license, start work. Not quite, because now there's 8 or 10 more government agencies you have to go register with. There's the Tax Bureau, the Customs Bureau, the Statistics Bureau, the Foreign Currency Bureau, 8 or 10 of these. And the problem is you can't do this in parallel. It has to be sequential, each of which takes about a week to 10 days. Some of you type A Americans would go crazy in that kind of environment. But there's nothing you can do to speed up the process. Hurry up and wait. Well, I shouldn't say that, because in China, money speaks. You can grease the palms to facilitate what you want to do. There are palms extended from everywhere. Well, we didn't grease any palms. The other thing you have to do is you have to set up bank accounts. You have to set up an account for foreign currency, US dollars, one for renminbi, local currency, for everyday operating uses. And then you have to set up a special bank account whose only purpose is to receive the foreign investment that you're going to make as your company, minimum of $250,000 or something like that, okay? That account can only be used for receiving these funds and then dispersing those funds into your operating account. It's a one-time sort of account. Okay, so we make the deposit, and you have to do that within 90 days. But that's not all over, because you have to show evidence that the money has been deposited. So it's not like taking the deposit slip to the Ministry of Commerce or even a bank letter stating that the funds have been deposited. We had to, and you will have to, engage an accounting firm which specializes in verifying that you have correctly deposited these funds, and pay them to write a report to this effect. Pay them to verify that I sent my money into my account. Okay, and well, that was another revelation. You'll find plenty of opportunities to spend your money to verify your own things in China. So it's a complicated process, very frustrating, but sort of within 90 days, if you follow this agent that you've enlisted to take you through the process, it finally gets done. Well, in the meantime, while all of this is going on, you're making the gamble that it will be granted, you will be able to do business, and so you start building out the office space. And let me tell you, building out and remodeling in China is quite an experience. Everything is an experience, but this one, it is such a headache because the skill level, the quality level, the expectations are not quite first world yet. So you have to constantly monitor the workers. But even then, because they haven't had that kind of training, the quality levels are well, substandard. But it's frustrating. Anyway, so you build out the office space, and then you also start talking to headhunters to help you hire people. So first you register, which is what I've been telling you about. Now we have to hire people. China has been open for business since 1986 when Deng Xiaoping decided that he would do this. So in the last 10 years or so, China has received every year more than $50 billion of foreign direct investment. That much money going into a country, you can think about all the problems that it creates. First of all, there just aren't enough adequately educated people in China for foreigners like us to go in and take advantage of all the opportunities. We want to set up companies, we want to set up product development, we want to set up research labs these days. There are not enough adequately trained people, even though China graduates thousands of engineers a year. It's still not enough. At least, well, I guess like any country, there are many people who are graduated in name, but in practice they're unusable. So finding the right people is a huge challenge in China, especially when our little company is competing against giants from all over the world. Big companies typically will go to a first-rate university and hire the entire graduating class, okay, engineers say. Bring them in, and within 2 or 3 months they weed them out. Most of them are not retained. I shouldn't say most, but many are not retained. But those are the hiring practices that you have to go up against. So what does a little company like Data.io do in this kind of environment? Well, what we did, we had to hire a recruiter, and we very, very patiently waited to find the one key person who could be the nucleus and the foundation, whose contacts could be used to find other people. And so we were setting up a technical engineering team there. So it took me 4 months to find this person who happened to have much more experience than was immediately needed, but he was hiring a middle manager for my first hire. And then using his contacts, he could help me find the engineers that we needed and then have enough management competency to be able to build a team, lead the team, and so on. We decided that we would take the time to screen very, very carefully, to hire the right people. As Jim Collins says, to get the right people on the bus. That's the first thing you need to do. And one of the criteria that we applied was that these people had to fit not only in terms of their competency, their ability to do the work, they had to fit with the values that we were installing in this entity. And Data.io has some very strong ethical values. And one of the first things we did in terms of screening these people was talk to them about these values. We'd put the values up on the wall and we'd ask them to talk to us about what they thought those values meant. Because we didn't want to tell them what we thought. They'd just be leading and they'd just say yes or no, right? So this was a very useful approach. In the end, let me tell you, we did find the few people that we needed. They're still with us after 3 years, much to my delight, except in one case. There was a significant fallout. But the people who are still with us today will say that the reason they came to Data.io and the reason they still are is because they remember the day they came in for the interview, the thing that Jason, their manager, and I talked to them about was the values of the corporation. And it struck them as being so strange and so refreshing. That's why they came. So we have not had the turnover that is typical of China. We've had very loyal, very dedicated, very committed, excellent people. Now let me tell you a little bit about the recruitment battle in China as by way of a story. Now, this I read about in one of the many articles in China. There was a software development team of about 10 people in a company. It was rated by a competitor. The entire team, 50% salary raise. The same day, they were re-rated and brought back into the company, 100% salary increase. So in one day, without leaving their desks, they had a 100% increase in pay. Such is the recruiting challenge in China. Be prepared, ladies and gentlemen. So the story, the lesson to us is if you're recruiting in China and hiring in China, don't try to compete on the basis of salary. You'll never make it against the big boys. So what we did was to compete on the basis of building and setting up a different kind of company where they would be happy and delighted to work because of the environment, because of the culture. And you have to be competitive in terms of paying market rates and salary, but if that's all you're doing, you'll lose them. Because people jump around. For every 20% increase in salary, they will change. And 20% increases in China in the past have been nothing. But you have to remember, it's nothing because by American standards, the salaries and wages in China are still very low. And so American companies, British companies, Western companies are willing to give these 20, 30% increases, whereas here, you know, the average is maybe 5%. But the wages are, the cost of doing business is going up in China, and one of these days it will saturate. Okay, so we set up the company, we hired people. Now, I guess we have to do some selling. This is an interesting situation in China. Did you know that there is an expectation of under-the-table payments for every single transaction? The expectation, the rule of thumb, is 10 to 15% of the price of the product. It's not just a dinner here or there. Times have changed, folks. 10 to 15%. So if you're selling a product that costs $10,000 to $500,000. Think of the amount of money that goes under the table for every single sale. One of my sales guys told me that there is a purchasing manager at the Flextronics plant down in the south of China near Shenzhen who has half a dozen luxury houses. This is a local Chinese guy who gets paid $1,000 to $2,000 US a month. He has half a dozen luxury houses and many other assets, I'm sure, that we don't know about. This is a very difficult game. America has anti-corruption laws. If we engage in that kind of practice, my CEO goes to jail, if he knows about it. It forced us to ultimately go into distribution. We no longer sell direct in China. Maybe we will on specific occasions. It's very, very difficult. You've all heard about what happened to Siemens in Germany. Their CFO was convicted. I mean, they had a slush fund of hundreds of millions. I think it's over, last I heard, it was like 1.5 billion euros that they had in these slush funds for paying bribes all over the world, including Asia and China. Schnitzer, Portland company, sells scrap metal. A month or two ago, the president of Schnitzer was settled in court, paid a fine of $250,000 for paying a bribe to a Chinese company to buy the scrap metal. I mean, this is very common. It's a huge problem, corruption in China. It is systemic, up and down, government, business, sideways at every level. I mean, you think about the pollution problems in China, has to do with corruption. I don't have time to go into it. I see my time is running out. So let me quickly move on and tell you about an unexpected challenge that I had in China. I didn't expect this. One of the biggest challenges I had was in communicating with my colleagues in Redmond about how things work in China and why they don't work in China. Why is it taking so long, Bob? I must tell you, I have had the most supportive management team in Redmond that you could ask for. But because what we were experiencing in China was so different and inconceivable to my American colleagues who've never been in that kind of environment, they just couldn't understand why things took so long. And the biggest challenge, perhaps, was having to say no so many times to all the well-intentioned good ideas that they were offering me to try to help me along. Have you tried this, Bob? Or tried that? It wouldn't work. It won't work. It won't work. And after a while, you begin to feel, is something wrong with me? I've become a naysayer. All I ever do is say no. The problem is you cannot take American Western business practices and just apply them in China. They don't work. That was a big challenge for me, having to explain to my colleagues and becoming a naysayer. Finally, I wasn't prepared for the amount of stress that I experienced in this kind of environment. So there were two major things that helped me. One was the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai. Wonderful organization, probably 2,000 American companies now. You can go to their meetings, network, hear from other expats going through exactly the same kind of experience. Great source of information. The other great help was the International Church in Shanghai. This is a congregation probably of 700 people now from 50 to 60 different countries, all worshiping in one language. Guess what? The language of business, English. Interesting experience, you know? And this church had many small groups, and so ours was a Friday night group that met in this apartment of the marketing director, China marketing director for Coca-Cola. Wonderful couple from Hong Kong, And there on a Friday night, there'd be maybe 20 people, 10 couples, and we'd get a chance to, you know, share our experiences. And so the men would go off in one group, and we'd be able to give one another ideas and suggestions. And so for a new kid on the block like me, I'd hear from them, and they'd tell me, you know, this is what I did in this situation. Very, very helpful. And the women, they'd go commiserate in their group over their absentee husbands who seemed to have no time for anything else, were never around. Well, you know, that's what you need. Because when you're in that kind of stressful environment, having a group of people who can share ideas and listen and give you ideas and pray for you, wow, is a tremendous help. That's really what saw us through the whole experience. And so those are some of our fondest memories of those people and friends that we made there. In fact, tomorrow we're meeting with a couple that we met in Shanghai. They happen to be coming to Portland. Isn't that amazing? So I close with this statistic. It's not a statistic. China today, for the first time in human history, has a generation of young people, 10 years and younger, who have no brothers or sisters, no cousins, no uncles, and no aunts. Think of that. That's a result of the one-child policy in China. Think of the ramifications of a society where people are growing up in that kind of context and the implications. It's hard to envision what this means. We do know that the generation of young people in China today in this moral vacuum are very self-centered. They are one child, they have two parents who both work, and they have two sets of grandparents. That's 6 adults catering to the needs and the whims of one single individual. Is it any wonder that this younger generation is extremely self-centered and almost dysfunctional in terms of everyday things like taking care of yourself? Serious problem. So I close it on that note.
So we got some time for some questions. Any questions?
Yeah, what kind of turnover rates were you experiencing? Well, maybe you could talk about some of the other companies and then what Data.io achieved.
All right, let me just rephrase the question. The question is, what kind of turnover rates were being experienced in China, in your experience?
Right. I think the turnover rates in foreign companies is probably 20 to 30% a year. At Data.io, we had to terminate one person for stealing our intellectual property. Apart from that, we have had only one voluntary departure. So out of 20 people, it's very low. And the reason, I believe, Bill, is because of the culture that we have installed there.
So actually, how does that compare to other companies' experience? 20 sounds like a pretty low number.
I don't think it's so low. 20 to 30%, that's terrible.
Well, okay. Sure. You got a question?
Bob, you mentioned the importance of values to the employees
Yeah.
that you brought aboard.
Yeah.
Could you discuss those values and what they are in a little bit?
So, the question was about the importance of values and what those were.
Yeah, well, we talked to them about wanting to have a world-class workforce. Everybody we brought in, we wanted to have the potential for being world-class, and we would support them towards that goal. We wanted to have a collaborative environment where people would work together. It was important that there be integrity in the organization from top to bottom. So We wanted people to have, to engage in breakthrough thinking. So those were some of the values that we have at Data.io corporately, and so these are the ones we bring. So when we put those up to them and asked them what they thought about those things, and engaged them in this dialogue. I mean, we talked about these probably for half an hour with every single person. And our interviewing techniques were that everybody would interview every single new candidate, collectively, not sequentially. And this was kind of interesting for many people. They found this different. They found it, they liked being able to talk at length with everybody in a give and take. What this did, not everybody liked it, but we were looking for people who could identify with us in these ways. And so it was a good screening technique. A lot of people said, no, this is not for me. And good, glad to know, right up front. Yes, sir.
Is fear of nationalization an old school theory and a whole new generation of people that don't even think about that anymore, or is that still a risk?
So is the fear of nationalization still apparent in today's society in China? Is that?
I don't hear about it, but to me, China is still unpredictable. Just because it is booming economically doesn't mean that it's stable as a nation. I haven't had the time to share with you about any of the political problems, the problems in the countryside with the poor people, and the riots that are taking place. There are thousands of riots in China. There's political repression, there's religious oppression. You think that China has freedom of religion, forget it, it does not. You think it has freedom of speech, it does not. This is remember, this is a political dictatorship experimenting with a free market economy. It's never happened before, okay? In my mind, there's still a lot of uncertainty, and lots of things could change. And if things go south in terms of the society, and they have to bring in the troops for another Tiananmen on a massive scale, nationalization, if pushed to the wall, they would do it. If pushed to the wall, they'd invade Taiwan. Fortunately, the Kuomintang had a big success in the recent parliamentary elections and greatly decreased the power of the president. And so the tensions should be subsiding there. But if China, if you push them to the wall, they are not a democracy. They act instantly. That's why they were able to build a city of 5 million people in 15 years. Right? It's nothing.
I think we got time for one more question, if there's any more. Okay. Otherwise, I think Bob, you'd be around to answer any other questions individually.
Thank you.
Okay.